The market was alive with noise, boots striking wood, coins clinking, voices rising in trade and laughter. Yet in the middle of that chaos stood a boy no one welcomed. His hair was long, his clothes worn thin, and his eyes carried the quiet fire of his Apache blood. Traders sneered, cowboys laughed, and every step he took seemed to draw another cruel remark. They mocked his silence, his hunger, his heritage, treating him as if he were less than the dust beneath their boots. The boy kept his head high, though his heart throbbed with humiliation. He had come not for charity, but to offer the few things he had, small crafts shaped by careful hands, tokens of his people's strength. Yet none would even look at them. Coins that rattled freely for others remained hidden when he approached. Their laughter grew sharper, and their rejection heavier, until it seemed the entire market existed only to remind him of his place at the bottom. Still, he refused to break. Behind his eyes burned the memory of his tribe, the elders who taught him patience, the warriors who showed him that silence could be stronger than rage. He endured the jeers with a calm that only deepened their cruelty, for nothing unsettles mockers more than the target who does not bow. He walked home that evening with empty hands, but his spirit carried a weight the cowboys could not understand. What the town did not know was that their laughter had already been heard by others. Word travels quickly in the desert, carried not just by mouths, but by wind, by silence, by eyes that watch from a distance. By mocking the boy, they had mocked his people, and in the Old West, such insults did not fade easily. They lingered like smoke, waiting for a spark. And so, when the next dawn broke, the market was no longer theirs alone. Dust rose on the horizon, and with it came the thunder of hooves and the presence of warriors. The Apache tribe filled the streets, not in violence, but in silence so heavy it smothered every laugh. The same men who had mocked the boy now felt their pride crumble beneath the weight of hundreds of steady gazes. What had been dismissed as weakness had become power, and the market would never forget it. The moment the first riders appeared, the air itself seemed to change. Dust swirled in the morning light as dozens of figures on horseback advanced with silent purpose, their presence stretching across the market like a shadow. Merchants froze mid-bargain, cowboys lowered their voices, and women pulled their children closer. It wasn't the sound of weapons that silenced them. It was the sheer weight of numbers, the sight of a people moving as one. At the front rode the elders, their faces carved by sun and years, their eyes burning with a wisdom the town could not measure. Behind them, warriors sat tall and proud, each movement carrying the unspoken message that they were not here by accident. And among them, barely noticed the night before, rode the boy. No longer alone, no longer small. His silence now had the strength of an entire tribe behind it. The same men who had mocked him at the market felt their throats dry. They had laughed at his thin frame, his worn clothes, his quiet defiance. But now they saw the truth that had always been there. He was not just a boy. He was the son of a people who carried centuries of resilience. Their pride, once loud, now crumbled beneath the steady rhythm of hooves against dirt. The merchants tried to busy themselves with their wares, but their hands shook as they arranged baskets of fruit and cloth. The cowboys, who the day before had sneered openly, kept their eyes fixed on the ground. No one dared to laugh, no one dared to whisper. The silence was thicker than any gun smoke, more suffocating than any shout. And in the center of that silence, the boy's gaze met theirs once more. The same eyes they had ridiculed now forced them to look away. He had said nothing, done nothing, but the presence of his people transformed him. What they thought was weakness had been only solitude. Now, with his tribe filling the streets, they saw that solitude is strength multiplied 100-fold. The chief of the tribe dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, his silence commanding. He did not need to shout or wave a weapon. The respect he carried spoke louder than any words. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding him forward until he stood before the same men who had mocked him the day before. The market square, usually filled with noise, now held only the crackle of tension. "You saw a boy," the chief said finally, his voice deep and steady. "We see a son." The words fell heavy, striking harder than fists. Each merchant, each cowboy, felt the sting of them. The insults they had thrown so easily the day before now echoed back in their minds, exposed as not just cruelty toward child, but as an insult to an entire people. The boy did not speak. He didn't need to. His silence had become his weapon, sharper than their laughter had ever been. Where once his quiet had made him seem powerless, now it carried the weight of justice. The same voices that mocked him now trembled in the absence of sound. Every heartbeat in the square seemed to drum the same truth. Respect had shifted. One of the men tried to speak, his voice breaking the silence, but no words came. He looked at the ground, his face flushed with shame. Another adjusted his hat nervously, his pride unable to protect him from the eyes of the tribe. Slowly, the realization spread across them all. They were not the ones in control. The boy they had laughed at had returned with something greater than pride. He had returned with belonging. The chief's hand remained firm on the boy's shoulder. "Remember this," he said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "The dust of this land does not belong to your laughter. It belongs to those who endure it." The words sank into every heart, leaving no escape. What had begun as cruelty in a market had become a lesson that would haunt them long after the tribe departed. And at its center stood the boy, no longer mocked, but honored by the silence of those who once ridiculed him. As the tribe stood in the heart of the market, the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the ground. Every movement of the Apaches was deliberate, measured, calm, and unshaken. They did not come to shout, nor to threaten. Their silence was heavier than any rifle could be. The boy, who had been the butt of cruel laughter the day before, now stood among warriors whose very presence rewrote his story. Where he had been seen as small, he was now seen as untouchable. The merchants tried to carry on with their trade, but their voices cracked under the weight of unease. Every sound seemed hollow, every gesture clumsy, as though the very market had turned against them. The boy's gaze did not waver. He walked slowly past the same stalls where he had been mocked, his steps echoing louder than the clatter of coins. Each footfall was a reminder that yesterday's cruelty had not broken him. It had summoned something far greater. The cowboys who had laughed the loudest shifted uncomfortably, gripping the belts of their holsters though their hands never moved to draw. They had been raised to believe strength was measured in bravado and mockery, but now they faced a different kind of strength, one that made their pride look like dust. The boy, once their target, was no longer beneath them. In fact, standing beneath the gaze of his people, they realized he had risen far above. The chief allowed the silence to stretch, letting shame seep into every corner of the square. He knew words were not needed when presence alone carried judgment. The tribe's stillness was not weakness, it was power, and that power burned into the hearts of those who had jeered, forcing them to face a truth they could not laugh away. The boy turned his eyes toward the cowboy who had mocked him most harshly. Their gazes locked, and in that quiet exchange, the man felt a weight he had never known before. He wanted to speak, to explain, to reclaim the ground beneath his feet, but the boy's silence was absolute. For the first time in his life, the cowboy felt smaller than the one he had scorned. The day stretched on, yet no one in the market dared to forget the lesson unfolding before their eyes. Children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts, watching in wide-eyed awe as the boy walked with his tribe. To them, he was no longer the frail figure ridiculed by grown men. He was proof that strength could wear many faces, that even silence could roar louder than cruelty. The boy's presence began to change more than the market. It began to change the people themselves. Some men avoided his gaze entirely, too ashamed to face the consequences of their laughter. Others studied him with newfound respect, realizing that what they had dismissed as weakness was, in truth, endurance. Women whispered softly, nodding at him as he passed, their eyes reflecting not pity but admiration. At midday, the chief spoke again, his words carrying through the heat and dust. "You mocked him because you saw only what your pride allowed. But you forgot that no one walks alone. Every child carries the strength of his people. Every insult you cast at him, you cast at us." His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of judgment no man could deny. The boy's heart pounded, but not from fear. For the first time, he felt the tribe's strength flow through him, lifting him higher than any insult had ever pushed him down. He did not need to speak. for the chief's words had given voice to his silence. In that moment, he understood. His worth had never been theirs to decide. The market that once rang with laughter now stood as a place of reckoning. The same streets that had mocked an Apache boy had become the stage for a truth carved into stone. Respect could not be taken by force, nor granted by prideful men. It was earned in endurance, sealed in silence, and carried by the tribe that filled the streets at dawn. By late afternoon, the market had transformed into something unrecognizable. The stalls still stood, the sun still baked the wooden beams, but the energy had shifted entirely. Where once cowboys strutted with pride and merchants barked prices with arrogance, now there was caution in every word, hesitation in every step. The Apache presence was not violent, but it was undeniable, like a storm cloud that lingered long enough to remind everyone of its power. The boy, once overlooked, now walked with a quiet authority that unsettled those who had ridiculed him. Every glance he cast was returned with lowered eyes. Every step he took reshaped the ground beneath him. The laughter that had cut him down the day before was gone, replaced by silence heavy with respect or fear. For the people of the town, the difference hardly mattered. The weight of their cruelty had returned to them, and the boy was no longer small in their eyes. The cowboys, men who prided themselves on fearlessness, found themselves strangely restless. Their usual swagger was gone, replaced by shifting feet and nervous glances. They had mocked the boy because they believed there would be no consequence. But now, seeing him flanked by warriors whose mere presence spoke of generations of resilience, they realized that their jeers had awakened something far beyond their control. The boy himself felt a transformation taking place. The sting of humiliation had not vanished, but it no longer owned him. What once burned as shame now burned as fuel, a reminder that strength is not found in avoiding cruelty, but in rising above it. He did not need revenge. He did not need their apologies. He had something greater, the proof that the power they thought they held over him had been broken forever. And as the sun dipped lower, painting the streets in gold, the boy walked through the heart of the market with his head held high. Yesterday, they had laughed at him. Today, they could only watch him pass in silence. Tomorrow, they would tell the story of the boy they mocked, and how his people came to fill the streets until every laugh was silenced. That evening, when the tribe gathered outside the town, a fire was lit, and the boy sat among them. For the first time, he did not feel like a child looking up at warriors. He felt like one of them. The chief placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded with a weight of pride in his eyes. "You carried their laughter without breaking," he said, his voice low and steady. "That is the strength of a warrior. Today, you stood not alone, but as the son of a people who will always stand with you." The words sank deep, louder in the boy's heart than any insult had ever been. He looked around the circle, faces lit by the fire, eyes sharp with unspoken unity, and he understood what the townsfolk had failed to see. His worth had never been measured by their coins or their approval. It had always been written in the blood of his people, in the endurance passed down through generations who had survived deserts, wars, and betrayals. Across the fire, the elders began to chant softly, their voices rising and falling like the desert wind. The boy listened, each note weaving into the scars of the day, turning pain into strength, humiliation into honor. Their voices did not erase what had happened in the market. They redefined it. The laughter he had endured became part of a larger story, one that would be told not as his failure, but as his moment of transformation. In the town behind them, the people lay restless, haunted by what they had witnessed. The boy's silence had been louder than their jeers, and the sight of the tribe filling the streets had burned into their memories. They would never mock him again, but more importantly, they would never forget that respect is not granted to the loudest voice. It is owed to the one who endures. The fire crackled higher, sparks flying into the night sky, and the boy lifted his eyes to the stars. For the first time, he did not feel like a shadow in someone else's world. He felt like a flame, carried not just by his own will, but by the strength of his people. Tomorrow, the town would remember their shame, but he would remember something greater, that from their scorn, he had risen, and with his tribe beside him, he would never walk alone again. The following morning, the town stirred cautiously, as if afraid the tribe might still be waiting in the streets. Merchants opened their stalls slowly, their eyes scanning the horizon, but their hands were steadier than the day before. No one dared to speak of the boy with laughter anymore. The echo of the Apache's silent presence still lingered, and with it came a shift too powerful to ignore. Respect, once dismissed as unnecessary, had been forced upon them like a brand. The boy walked through the market again, but this time not in rags of humiliation. His clothes were still simple, his frame still young, yet there was something in the way he carried himself that made men step aside. He needed no warriors at his side now. The memory of them was enough. Whispers followed him, but they were no longer cruel. They were filled with awe, unease, even admiration. The boy who had been mocked was now a symbol of what they could not break. For the first time, he approached a stall without fear. The merchant's hand shook slightly as he placed fruit into the boy's bag, refusing payment. "Take it," the man muttered, his eyes lowered. The boy did not argue, nor did he smile. He simply accepted it, knowing that it was not charity, but recognition. The same people who had jeered had now been silenced into humility. Cowboys who had once spat insults now tipped their hats as he passed, their pride swallowed in the face of something larger than themselves. They did not offer apologies, for words could never undo what they had done. But their gestures, small, hesitant, filled with reluctant respect, were acknowledgment enough. In the language of the Old West, silence and lowered eyes carried more weight than any apology. The boy understood then that his life had changed forever. He was no longer invisible, no longer small. He was a reminder, a living truth that cruelty could be endured until it transformed into respect. The market, once his place of shame, had become his stage of triumph. And though he said nothing, the streets carried his message more clearly than any voice could. As weeks passed, the story of that day spread far beyond the town. Travelers carried it on horseback, weaving it into their tales around distant campfires. They mocked an Apache boy, they would say, but by dawn his people filled the streets and no one laughed again. Each retelling stripped the cruelty of its sting and replaced it with reverence for the boy who endured and the tribe that stood with him. The tale grew, not as gossip, but as legend. It became a warning to those who mocked without thought, and an anthem for those who had suffered in silence. In every town where the story was told, eyes turned to the quiet ones, to the overlooked and dismissed, and people began to wonder what hidden strength might lie beneath the surface. The boy had become more than himself. He had become a symbol. Back in his own settlement, the boy trained harder, worked longer, and grew into the man his tribe always believed he would become. The scorn he had faced no longer haunted him. It sharpened him. Each insult remembered became a scar, turned into armor. Each laugh a reminder of what he had conquered. He was no longer just a child carried by his people. He was becoming a warrior forged in the fires of both cruelty and endurance. The chief often watched him with quiet pride. "Strength is not in the hand that strikes first," he said to the boy one evening. "It is in the heart that stands after being struck." Those words carried more weight than any victory in battle, for they defined the boy's journey. He had already won the greatest battle, the battle of being mocked, humiliated, and yet refusing to fall. And so, the Apache boy who once stood alone in a market full of jeers had become a name spoken with respect across the frontier. His silence had thundered louder than their laughter, and his endurance had carved a story that the Old West would never forget. Seasons changed, and with them, the boy grew into his strength. The town that once mocked him no longer dared to raise its voice against him or his people. Instead, they treated his presence with the same caution they gave to storms rolling across the desert horizon. He was no longer just the Apache boy. He was a living reminder of the day when arrogance met silence, and silence won. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that unsettled those who remembered their laughter. Each step through the market was a mirror held up to their shame. The merchants who once sneered now scrambled to show him respect, and the cowboys who prided themselves on bravado found their voices falter when he passed. Their pride had been built on cruelty, but it had collapsed under the weight of his endurance. Among his tribe, he grew into the role of warrior not by boasting, but by embodying patience and resilience. His story was retold to younger children, who listened with wide eyes as elders reminded them, strength is not only in the arm, but in the spirit that refuses to bow. The boys' silence that day became a teaching, a living lesson for generations who would inherit the desert winds. The chief, now older and slower, often placed his hand on the young man's shoulder with pride. Your silence changed more than their laughter, he told him. It changed us. It reminded us that the world may mock us, but as long as we endure, it cannot break us. Those words sank deep, shaping the young warrior's path as surely as any blade or bow. And in the town, whispers of regret lingered. The cowboy who had laughed loudest lived long enough to see the boy grow taller, stronger, more respected than he himself would ever be. Every time their eyes met across the market, the cowboy looked away, his shame permanent, etched into the very story that would outlive him. Years later, when the boy had become a man and the chief's seat passed to another, his legend remained rooted in both town and tribe. He was not remembered for a great battle or for spilling blood, but for something far rarer, turning humiliation into honor. In a land that glorified violence, his story stood apart, whispered with respect because it proved that strength could be greater than pride and dignity sharper than any blade. Children in the tribe grew up hearing his name as a symbol of courage. Around campfires, elders told the story of the day the streets filled with riders, not for war, but for silence. They explained how laughter had turned into shame, and how a boy who stood alone one day stood unshaken with his people the next. That lesson carved itself into their hearts, shaping how they faced their own trials. The market itself bore the memory. Though years had passed, no one who lived through that morning forgot the sight of warriors filling the streets, their silence heavier than thunder. Merchants told travelers in hushed tones, pointing to the stalls where it happened, their voices soft with a mixture of awe and guilt. The boy had outgrown his rags, but the story of his endurance remained stitched into the very soil. For him, life continued with the rhythm of the desert, hardship, survival, growth. Yet he never forgot the day his silence rewrote his place in the world. It was not the tribe's arrival alone that had changed everything, but his choice to endure without bending, to face laughter without yielding. That choice had given the silence its power. And so, the Apache boy who once stood mocked in the market became a man remembered with reverence across the frontier. His story lived on not in coin, nor in conquest, but in the lesson it carried, that respect, once earned, cannot be taken back, and that even the smallest voice, when carried by dignity, can silence the loudest laughter of the Old West. The story of the Apache boy is not just about a moment of humiliation in a crowded market. It is about the power of resilience and the silence that speaks louder than cruelty. They mocked him because he stood alone, but by sunrise, the strength of his people filled the streets, turning laughter into shame and scorn into respect. That transformation was not given to him. It was claimed through endurance, through the quiet fire of someone who refused to break. It reminds us that dignity is not something the crowd can decide. The merchants and cowboys believed they held the power to define him, but what they never understood is that true worth comes from within and from the bonds that cannot be severed. His tribe did not save him out of pity. They revealed the truth that had always been there. He was never alone, and his silence was not weakness, but strength waiting to be seen. The market never forgot that day, and neither should we. For every jeer that once echoed against him became the very stage on which his strength was revealed. What seemed like a boy's defeat turned into a lesson that reshaped an entire town. The same men who mocked him were forced to lower their eyes, not because he sought revenge, but because he endured with dignity until they could no longer ignore him. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson of all. When the world laughs, when voices rise against you, remember that their scorn is temporary, but your endurance can echo forever. You may feel small, invisible, or unwanted, but strength is not proven in the absence of cruelty. It is proven in how you rise above it. Respect, once earned, cannot be undone, and silence, when carried with courage, can thunder louder than any insult. If this story spoke to you, let it live beyond these words. Subscribe to the channel to walk with us through more unforgettable tales. Leave a like to show that stories of dignity and resilience matter, and share in the comments what this lesson awakened in you. Together, we keep alive the voices of the Old West that remind us, even in a world of dust and pride, respect is forged in endurance and carried forever.